Oh yeah, I never saw the show, but I just saw that piece over at, I don't know, near the parking lot where you come in. Did you see the permanent installation? I think it's a section of it. Probably about 30 minutes. Yeah. Yeah, that's what it is. Okay. Yeah. I think it's part of the permanent collection now. Okie dokie.
Hear about those babysitters.
Well, the nature of this talk today is my work over the last 10 years, and it's also my work starting with the abstract work. Before that, I was working, doing figurative work, portraits and figure studies, and then the work became more and more abstract till I got to the point where I felt that the forms that composed the figures were more important, more interesting to me than the actual figures. And I started to think in terms of sculpture being a language in which I could more or less speak, and I no longer needed a structure such as the figure, and I could start to compose almost like three-dimensional poems or something like that. And all right, in the first, okay, we'll start with the slides here. These pieces are about twice the size that they really are. They're half scale. Some of the forms are suggestive of figures or parts of figures. I got a tremendous excitement of sort of juxtaposing various forms. That was probably the most important thing to me, putting one form next to another and seeing what happened.
What sort of colors are
These are all blackish brown patina, and the shiny surface is more polished bronze, which would be a goldish color. This was kind of an afterthought, this piece. After a while, these harder edged forms started to come into my work. So I wanted to sort of look back and try to describe it in a time sequence. And it was, and this piece did that. Now here is another piece which is part of that whole idea of bringing together those different types of forms. This is the beginning of a section of my work, this sort of a unit, which I was trying to reduce my forms to basic forms, which would be a sort of a dictionary, a kind of a sculptural dictionary which could be looked at and would be the kind of reduction of all my forms. And this is a very crude one, the very crude first of that. Then I started to apply these forms to every sculpture. And this area in here is supposed to be the sort of consummation of all of the forms reduced to this little unit. There are usually 4 forms composing this unit. And each form more or less expressed a certain part of a greater dialectic that I was involved with, which is also throughout the entire piece, the relationship between these forms and these forms. And another view of the same piece. This piece is about 7 feet high, and 3 different views. This is the unit on the left in its almost final state, but it was still in a period of transition here. I was fairly satisfied with this. I had a few more refinements to make on that. This was a show I had in 1970 in New York, the Graham Gallery, and it was sort of the coming together of all these different ideas. These are the units, 2 sets of these units in their final state. What?
Doug, can you go back one?
Sure.
What is the relation between the 4 forms on the small circle in the middle there and the forms on the in the final unit? Are they an earlier stage of the same?
Well, it's kind of
that they are.
in a sense, that's what they are. Or they're just other forms which sort of redefine those forms, but they're kind of aberrations of those forms.
So they would only exist in one piece. They're not carried over.
Right, they're never carried over. Whereas the other ones, I arrived at a certain pattern, and I just made copies of those forms. For the next 5 or 6 years, I just recast the exact same forms and applied them to all the sculptures. This piece was kind of odd for me to do. It came to my mind, and I didn't. It really wasn't expressed. It really wasn't the sort of main line of my work because it's so dominated by this cube and all of these forms. There wasn't enough of a relationship with some other type of form in it to really satisfy me. But it was way off to one side in the concert of my work, and kind of was more important as being one work within the concert than actually being a good example of what I was trying to do. This is more centrally located, more of an even balance of. It's another view of the same piece. I also got very excited about the reflections in this curved surface. When I would put this area is polished and this is a dark or black patinaed surface, and when I put forms against a polished surface, they would abstract in the curved surface, and I would get ideas for other forms, and I'd draw the forms in their slightly abstracted shape, and then I would work them into other sculptures in the future, into various parts of them. All right, now this was a definite evolution here. Okay, at this point I was involved with these pieces which would stand on pedestals, and this is around 1969, 1970, and one evening while lying down on a couch in my place up in upstate New York, this woman that I was living with was taking some long cord and putting it against the wall so she could stretch it out. It was kind of kinky, and she wanted to straighten it out, and she did that by pinning these 2 long thick pieces of cord against the wall. And at the time I had this little table in front of my couch where I was resting, and I had a little central mass of a sculpture, something similar to this, which in essence was this central mass. It was on the table, and if you can imagine, here was this little central mass on a table, and then I was lying down like this, and she had these 2 pins here and 2 pins there, and was stretching the line across. And I saw this line cutting right through my sculpture, and I got very excited, and I thought maybe I could work that into my sculpture. And so I took that into my studio, and I started adding these forms into it and coming out of it. So this was the first piece like that. And then I got the idea that all my work would have this sort of a structure. Second view of this piece. And then I did all of these pieces, and this was another show that I had at this Graham Gallery. All the works were designed like this. These pieces were all designed. It wasn't an afterthought to add those forms coming into it and emanating from them. Where this piece was originally designed as a central mass. It was supposed to just sit on a pedestal like the previous works, without those forms, and that would have sort of satisfied me. And I also saw that there was a lot of area in here to do other things, sort of redefine what I was trying to do in the central mass and take it one step further in different directions.
Sort of evolving the four forms that we see on all the sculptures?
Yes, and that was it was in the past. Probably back at the stage where the first group that were in a show, which was probably about 2 years before this, I came to a final set of forms which I was using, and I just recast them over and over again. And when I wanted them on a larger scale, I would blow them up into a larger scale, but they're exact same forms blown up to a larger scale. And these forms stayed with me for about 6 years. I just kept reusing them. Also, another relationship started to occur this thing right here. Now, they're slightly different in every piece, and then I came to a point where I started using them all the time. And I made a set in aluminum, and then I kept recasting these two things here.
Was this a group show?
This was
all these pieces together.
This was in a one-man show.
I know. I mean, this was a show.
Right.
This wasn't Chelsea.
What?
This wasn't Chelsea Hotel.
No.
Oh.
This is at the Graham Gallery. This is about the last of these pieces that had a patina in the polished sections. It started to disturb me, the reflections, and I wanted to make a more sculptural statement. I was getting, I no longer wanted the reflections and all the forms abstracting themselves in the surface. And I didn't want this illusionistic image. I wanted a much harder, more sculptural image. And so I started to patina the entire surfaces of the pieces. And this is a group of them.
It's not a show, is it?
No, this is actually, these pieces were set up in the Chelsea Hotel. I was going from one dealer to another, and I set them up in this room, and then I invited a few dealers over to look at them.
It's kind of feeling to it. It's like an invasion.
Yeah. it was really interesting because this is on the 10th floor, and Moses Sawyer, the painter Moses Sawyer, had his studio a few doors down, and he came by. The person that eventually became my dealer, Andrew Crispo, was a good friend of his, and he invited him over to see my work. And Moses is he was about 4'10", and he would be walking around the sculptures, and then for him they were, I think, monumental pieces. Also, at this, I got more interested in the previous work. There were a lot happening in these forms, and I wanted to concentrate the eye in the center. You would move up and down and kind of concentrate in the center. So I started simplifying the long forms leading up into the central mass, although the tops were still very active. But then after a point, I started to reduce them so that most was happening around the central mass. This was in the lobby of Boston City Hall. And this is the largest of this series, which I call Creads. This is the same piece in a different environment in front of the Rose Art Museum, Brandeis. It's a detail of the same piece. You see here are the two major units in my work, these 4 forms and these 2 forms. It had become, in every work, they were in every work. Now I'm going to show you a little film of installing this piece in front of the museum by Carolyn Swartz. It was just scale that was dominating you. I wanted it to be more intimate. This is another piece almost the same size, and this is in Wichita at the Ulrich Museum. This is a show of Creads that I had there a few years ago. So here's a good example of some other work. Now this piece is about 65 inches high, and it weighs 400 pounds. It's one of the later Creads. Before, a piece that size would probably weigh 200 pounds. And these forms are really thick, and we'll get to a better photo of this.
Why 3 legs?
There was something about it just sort of visually and structurally satisfied me. I don't know, it's not symbolic, or anything like that. This was a smaller piece. This was a scale model for a proposed commission for Dartmouth College. It was supposed to be 12 feet high. And you see, this is kind of an early Cread in that I hadn't settled on the one form emanating. There are 2 forms here which go off the top. And this is an odd piece in that it was very symmetrical in that this side and the other side were the exact same. This is that piece that I was talking about, one of the later Creads. The forms that are in this, the basic forms composing the central mass, which are usually two larger forms and then several smaller forms, were in the earlier Kriyads were relatively simple. They were squares or they're triangles or very simple squares put together to form. Okay, and then after a while I started to make those forms more complex or more irregular. It's hard to see them, but sometimes the forms, like I would get ideas for these forms by the form of the central mass when you look at it from the top. I wanted to sort of define and redefine the sculpture in all the different planes. I was obsessed with a multi-dimensionality of these sculptures, not only three-dimensionality, moving around 360 degrees, but also moving in the views from underneath and on top and from all different angles. All right. Like I said before, the basis of my work was this structure which I was relating to, and concurrently with that, I've always been doing a kind of almost automatic type of drawing, where I would draw various forms that would pop into my head, or I would just start drawing with no idea of what was going to happen, and I sort of discover some forms which I'd later work into my sculptures. And over the years, these drawings kept evolving, and they got to the point where I was getting very excited about them as being just finished works in their own right. And so I had this sort of conflict where this is all I wanted to do was these sculptures, and these other forms were imposing themselves upon me. So I decided I'd make them into paintings. And this is the first one. It was also satisfying a need to work very flat. After being a sculptor obsessed with three-dimensionality, I found, a relief to work to just concern all my efforts on a very two-dimensional plane. They're about 3/4 the size that you see.
What sort of material is it?
Oh, this is acrylic paint on canvas. I like making them as active as possible, I think. I enjoyed suggesting movements. I was always trying to do that in the Kriyads, but it was more controlled, and I was sort of juxtaposing various motion to build up a kind of static energy. But with these paintings, I was getting into moving in different directions and not balancing things off, letting forms move from left to right. And then after a while, I brought them down to even tighter scale. Then these paintings resulted from that.
Did you use like a magnet to get the lines and stuff? It looks like something.
A magnet?
Well, it looks like something where you'd use iron filings.
Oh, right.
Those
No.
kind of patterns.
I would just, I would do the drawings for these paintings in one sitting. I would just set up a certain shape that I wanted to work with, or I might have an idea, like for example, that I wanted to relate these two, this form in this basic form together. And I start off by drawing them out. And then I would just, it was very spontaneous. I would just start doing it and I'd twist, change direction and try to get things happening here.
Is it all freehand kind of stuff?
Yes.
No tape?
No. Basically, it's almost in a sense like casting the way I would do these. I would do a drawing, then I would transfer the drawing to tracing paper with a pencil, and then I would turn the tracing paper over and then redraw those lines on the back side. Then I would put that on top of the canvas and then mark those lines onto the canvas. And then I would paint in the little forms, and each form has 3 coats of paint. So it was almost like I was still casting. I was filling in forms.
Give us an idea of how long it'll take you to paint this.
This is about, well, if a working week is 7 days a week, 15 hours a week, it'd take about a week and a half or 2 weeks.
We're gonna have to see that. What about your creatives?
Uh,
The initial drawing to when I finished sculpture. So.
The drawing of the creads was done when I was making the full-scale model. And I would usually do those models in one sitting or standing. I'd get an idea, I'd have preconceptions about what the central mass was going to look like. And then I would fabricate that out of particle board, 3/8" particle board, the central large forms. And also some forms I would make by clay, plaster, wax process. Then I would put those 2 forms together, the 2 big ones. Then I'd balance that from a string hanging from the ceiling. And I would kind of sort of set it up in the middle of my studio, and then I would almost attack it. And I'd move around it, and I'd relate to it. I'd do all the forms and do the entire thing in one sitting. And I had this sort of discipline where I felt that I had to finish the whole thing. And if I stopped for a few hours, then the piece wouldn't be right. It would be like 2 days' work or something like that. But then the last few pieces, I decided I didn't have to, stay with it all in one sitting or standing. Oh, the creads would take, a 70-inch cread would take approximately 2 months to do the entire process of making the original model and the molds and casting and finishing and putting it together in the patina. Yeah, the largest cread took me 3 months to make, and I was really pushing it. I was pushing it very hard so that I could have it in this particular show, which it didn't materialize.
What years were you doing these?
These are 1975.
Is it my eye?
It's probably out of focus. Yeah. Oh, that's better. Oh, wow, that's nice. This was about the last. I did one more drawing for a painting after this, and I never finished it. At this point, or around February in well, not exactly at the point when I finished this painting, but in February of 1976, I get the idea that I wanted to connect these forms. I wanted to bring them into sculpture very directly. And I decided I'd connect the forms and give them a thickness which would be sort of an averaging of the width of the forms on the frontal plane. And I would do this very, very flat sculpture, which grew out of these.
Did you show this?
Not really. I've never had a formal exhibit of them. And this is the first of the cast bronze pieces that grew out of these paintings.
I think your brown stuff is impeccable.
Oh, thank you. These are, if you looked at them from the side, it would be just a straight line, vertical line. And of course, you see some cross-hatching. But they're very, very flat, but I want to do everything on the frontal plane.
How wide is that?
That last piece, these pieces are about twice the size. That piece is probably 15 inches wide. This one is a little less. And these were very spontaneous drawings. Most of the drawings were done in less than an hour. I wanted them to be very spontaneous, and a lot of them were done on the train to New York.
These are cast?
Yes, these are solid cast bronze.
Is the other side of them the same, or is
Yes.
the other side so you finish both sides?
They're finished all over both sides.
What do you use to make them all?
Well, I do the drawings, and then I would transfer them to styrofoam. I would stick pins through the drawing so they leave an imprint on the styrofoam, and then I would connect the points on the styrofoam with a felt tip marker. Then I cut that out on a jigsaw, and then I would make sand molds from the styrofoams. Now here's a typical drawing which led to a sculpture. And this is a sculpture. Occasionally I would simplify in the final sculpture a little bit, but most of the time it was a pretty accurate transfer.
Nice drawing, but for painting it's better as a sculpture. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well,
What do the names of the sculptures? I noticed they all
oh boy. Okay. Well, it's this whole obsession with the titles of my sculpture started off when the first show that I had, and the director said there was a show of barns up at the time by I think the artist's name was Martin. He painted barns, and his paintings were Barn 1, Barn 2, Barn 3. And the director of the gallery said, I don't want names like Barn 1, Barn 2, Barn 3, or Untitled. And I felt at that time it was absurd to attach a word to a sculpture, because it was two different languages, and it was my work had nothing to do with literal information, and I was trying to compete with words and things like that, so I wasn't going to add on words. But I realized there was a problem. You have to have a name for things in order to refer in cataloging, etc., etc. So I started thinking of sounds that interested me, and then I wanted to relate my sculpture. So like the first series that I started titling were called Eads, and each piece was an Ead. One was Ife Ead, another one was Frey Ead, and that would I could associate one with another that way. And occasionally one sculpture would influence another sculpture, and they would come along later, and I would title it with a title similar to the one that it influenced, so sort of a cross-reference. And then as I changed series, after the Eads came the Creads, and then there were Ads, and there were And the pieces done before the EADs I titled after the fact, and I called them pre-ads. And these pieces slightly related to the AAD series of reliefs, which I don't have any slides of. And so I wanted to make them slightly different, so I put a K in the middle and called them ACADs. So all these flat pieces are ACADs. Now, up until now, most of the drawings were done as a very spontaneous, basically in one sort of sitting I would do them and they would be done, and I wouldn't do that many alterations on the final drawing. They were probably transferred right to to bronze. In this case, I had struggled with this particular drawing for a long time, and I don't know if you can see, but this is kind of there's a lot of tape here. It had a more horizontal structure. I knew I wanted to work with these, 5 square-shaped forms, and I just sort of balanced them till I got them to the point where they had the sort of degree of precariousness that sort of satisfied me for the particular moment, and then I taped them down. This is and just because I set up an idea that I wasn't going to have a basic structure, elements of structural relationships were starting to reappear in my work. And because I hadn't done that, I decided, this piece, or for the next few works, I was going to use these squares, or forms that were kind of like the basic structure was a square.
What kind of metal are these?
These are all cast bronze. Now here's another one which I worked on a lot and cut up and redesigned. The basic structure being one large rectangle, another smaller one at another angle to that, and a small square here. And I was going to, it was the same old thing where I was relating to the structure of the creeds, although I was relating to these forms, and I was going to kind of tune them to the state of my psyche at the time, or whatever satisfied me. Now this, at another date, I could approach trying to draw these forms, and it would probably be much more relaxed, or much more calm, or something like that.
You lost your little corner there? Get a little black dot there.
Where? No, in sculpture I have to acknowledge gravity. Little detail of that piece. These were a lot of hand filing. I tried to get a power tool to help me with these, but there's no power tool available that could get into these little cracks and do the fine edges, so they're all done by hand filing.
How long did one of these take?
These took about 2 weeks each. this is another part of these trying to, use these square forms. Although I wanted to, in this particular one, I was getting excited because it looked like the ones in the bottom were being crushed by the weight of the ones on top. Okay, wait a second.
How much does that weigh?
This weighs about 15 pounds. Oh, I get it. This piece was a design, it was more of a horizontal piece, and it was more typical of about 10 pieces back, and I decided I didn't like it, so I cut it up and I just sort of took sections of it and rotated it off almost a center point.
How much of the painting was concurrent with this, and how much did you just leave the painting when you started making the cast?
Oh, I stopped the painting totally when I started making the cast pieces. Actually, the chronology is, the last painting was in '75, and then I continually made creads, and I just thought about those paintings, and then in 1976 or 1977, I started doing the first cast piece.
You don't make triads anymore.
Creads?
Yeah.
Well, I haven't made one for over a year, and I'm thinking about maybe not making any more, but I haven't totally committed myself to that idea yet. I'd like to. It was set up as a system where I would relate to that over a long period of time, so I kind of think that I will make them, but I don't know when I'm going to do the next one. It might be in a year or in 5 years, but I'd like to relate to that structure and see what happens. If I make one, it's going to be a lot different than what it was, but it will still have the same basic structure.
The last creative that you made didn't have those 4 forms that you put on all of them?
It
Or
did.
didn't have those 2 forms hanging down?
Right. Well, after making about 21 of these cast pieces, I decided I wanted to work on a larger scale, and I wanted to simplify my interests, and I wanted to work on a larger scale, and the sculptures in mine didn't lend themselves to the casting process, so I had to learn heliarc welding of sheet metal, primarily sheet bronze, and then later I started to work with steel, sheet steel. Now this is the first welded piece. Now this piece was influenced by, this is also what I call the ACAD series, and because the structure was somewhat similar to an earlier ACAD, Gila ACAD, I call this one Gila ACAD, so that I could, relate them. The drawings for these pieces weren't as spontaneous as the drawings for the earlier cast pieces. I found that when things were simplified, I had to work on them a lot more. Some of them were exactly like the drawings, but the majority of them I had to do a lot of work on to get them to my satisfaction. Here I was taking an arch form and superimposing my various forms. I got very excited about the idea of doing a piece like this about 20 feet high, so you could walk in between. It would become more environmental. These are, the next few drawings are for a commission for Brandeis. Originally the piece was going to be about 3/4 the size of this. It was going to be welded bronze. It was a relief to go on a wall. It was going to be about 3 inches thick, 3 to 4 inches thick. And I did several drawings, and I brought over drawings from these sketches, which are pretty much